What else?
Then there are asset freezes. This means blocking access to funds or stopping the transfer of money held by specific people, companies, or even the government itself in the countries imposing the sanctions.
Freezing their money, essentially.
Pretty much. Next are financial penalties. These can be actual fines or restricting access to the international financial system, like making it harder to get loans or do certain transactions.
So making it harder to operate financially on the world stage.
Exactly. Then you have diplomatic measures. This is about isolation, maybe kicking out diplomats, boycotting international meetings, that sort of thing.
Giving them the cold shoulder internationally.
Right. There are also arms embargoes, which are pretty self-explanatory, stopping the sale or transfer of weapons and military gear. And finally, travel bans, which stop specific individuals linked to the targeted regime from traveling.
That's quite a toolbox. So once these measures are put in place, how do they actually work? What's the mechanism meant to create that pressure?
Well, the core principle is simple enough. Apply economic pressure. How it works mechanically is by restricting a nation's ability to trade globally, limiting its access to financial resources, and making it harder to get hold of goods and technology from other countries. The basic idea is to make it much more costly for them not to comply with whatever demands are being made.
Raising the cost of defiance, basically.
Precisely. But the sources also add a nuance here. To do this effectively, you really need to understand the target nation's specific weaknesses, its dependencies. It's about finding the right economic levers to pull. And there's this tricky balance, trying to achieve the political goal without, completely tanking the economy and causing a massive humanitarian crisis. Though achieving that balance is, well, notoriously difficult.
Yeah, that calibration sounds incredibly challenging. To really get a handle on how this works in practice, I think we need some examples. The sources give us a few key case studies. Let's go to Venezuela.
Right, Venezuela is a good example from the material. The U.S. and some other countries imposed sanctions targeting several key areas. They really went after the oil sector. That's Venezuela's economic lifeline. They restricted its export and sale, hitting the government's main source of cash hard.
So, straight for the economic jugular.
Pretty much. Then there were significant financial sanctions. These limited Venezuela's access to international markets and froze assets belonging to key government officials, basically making it super difficult for them to manage state finances or borrow money. And importantly, there were also diplomatic measures. Things like recognizing the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, were aimed at isolating the Maduro government internationally.
Okay, so hitting their income, their finance, and their standing. The material also mentions North Korea as an example of what they call primary sanctions. What does that mean?
Right. North Korea is used as an example of sanctions often initiated through the UN Security Council, mainly in response to their nuclear and missile programs. These are often seen as the first layer. These included broad trade embargoes, stopping exports and imports of certain goods, especially those that could help their weapons program.
Trying to cut off supplies for those programs?
Exactly. There were also financial transaction restrictions limiting North Korea's access to the international banking system, plus freezing of assets for individuals and companies directly involved in those illicit programs, and, of course, an arms embargo to prevent military buildup.
A very focused set of measures there. And then we get to Russia, especially post-2022. The sources describe this as incredibly extensive.
Oh, absolutely. Unprecedented scale, really. The sources highlight the massive wave of unilateral sanctions from Western countries, the US, EU, UK, Canada, others which built on measures already in place since 2014 after the Crimea annexation. Key actions included sweeping restrictions on the financial sector. This was huge, targeting the central bank, kicking major Russian banks off the SWIFT messaging system.
Cutting them off from core global finance infrastructure.
Precisely. They also imposed new rules on goods and services in crucial sectors, aviation, energy, shipping, aiming to degrade Russia's industrial capacity, particularly its military industrial base. And then there was this huge circle of designated individuals who got sanctioned. We're talking close associates of Putin, people facilitating the military effort, officials in occupied territories, and oligarchs with big assets in the West who are seen as linked to the regime or key industries.
Wow. So hitting the financial system, key industries, and the people propping up the regime. This brings us to a really critical point the sources raise, the legal basis for all this, and the major challenges in actually enforcing these sanctions.
Yes, that's a huge part of the picture. The sources describe the legal side as this complex mix of domestic laws in the countries imposing sanctions and broader international legal principles. It's pointed out that while UN-mandated sanctions often carry the most international weight, these unilateral ones, imposed by single nations or blocs like the EU, are used really frequently, especially when getting UN Security Council agreement is impossible, often because of vetoes from permanent members like Russia or China.
And I imagine enforcement isn't the same everywhere.
Not at all. The sources really emphasize this variation. The U.S. is presented as having the most, well, far-reaching powers and using sanctions most extensively. Their Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, is the key agency, and they often operate under what's called strict liability.
Strict liability, what does that mean practically?
It means you could face civil penalties even if you didn't intend to break the rules. If a violation occurs, you can be held responsible. And if they think it was a willful violation, they can pursue criminal charges.
That sounds tough.
It is. And significantly, the U.S. is often willing to apply its rules extraterritorially beyond its own borders, especially if U.S. dollars or the U.S. financial system are involved. The material even mentions a December 2023 executive order that basically expanded OFAC's power to go after foreign banks if they deal with Russia's military-industrial complex. The potential penalty, getting cut off from the U.S. dollar system, huge leverage.
Wow, that's immense power. How does the EU compare?
Well, the EU operates through its common foreign and security policy. The sources did note that, initially at least, there were quite different approaches among member states on how strictly they implemented and enforced sanctions, but there's a push for change. A new directive is supposed to harmonize enforcement across all the member states, aiming for May 2025.
And the UK, now that it's outside the EU?
The UK basically kept the EU framework initially, but has been developing its own specific measures. The sources suggest, though, that maybe enforcement has been a bit fragmented, perhaps under-resourced, involving several different agencies. And apparently, this has led to fewer publicly reported successful enforcement actions compared to, say, the U.S. They even mentioned some companies publicly admitting they'd breached UK sanctions. But what's really fascinating here, and the sources stress this, is how the actual burden of making sanctions work often falls squarely on the private sector.
How so?
Well, governments impose the sanctions, but it's businesses, banks, insurance companies, manufacturers, shipping firms that are on the front lines. They have to implement them. This means massive reporting requirements, incredibly complex due diligence checks all through their supply chains, and huge risks if they get it wrong. We're talking potentially crippling fines, criminal charges, and massive reputational damage.
So it creates this huge compliance headache for companies all over the world.
Absolutely. It's a major operational challenge.
Okay, so given all these measures and the difficulties in enforcing them, what do the sources tell us about the actual impacts on the countries being targeted? They mention economic, social, geopolitical effects. Let's look at the Iran case study first.
Right. One source detailed the Iran case pretty thoroughly. Economically, the impact was clearly significant. They saw a huge decline in oil exports because of U.S. and EU sanctions, which really choked off a primary source of government revenue. This fed into major currency depreciation. The Iranian rial lost a lot of value, causing instability, and trade in general was hit hard, making it tough to import necessary goods and leading to shortages in sectors that depend on international trade.
And beyond the economy, what about the humanitarian social side?
Yeah, the sources point to real problems there. Obstacles in getting hold of medical supplies and technology, which obviously impacted healthcare. There was a noticeable rise in unemployment and just general economic hardship for ordinary people. And funding for important things like education and social services also took a hit because government revenues were down.
That sounds pretty grim. Did it have geopolitical effects too?
It did. There was definitely a shift in diplomatic dynamics as Iran looked for ways to get sanctions relief. And the material suggests this economic pressure was a factor, maybe a significant one, in pushing Iran towards the nuclear negotiations, eventually leading to that 2015 JCPOA deal, where some sanctions were lifted in return for limits on their nuclear program.
So a really wide-ranging impact on Iran. Another source provided some specific economic numbers for Russia after the 2022 invasion.
Yes, that source painted a picture of considerable economic disruption in Russia. Estimates suggest Russia's GDP is maybe 10–12% lower than where it might have been without the invasion and sanctions, and personal disposable income, possibly 20–25% below where it would have been. They've had bouts of high inflation. Domestic interest rates shot up over 20% at one point. They lost access to a chunk of foreign exchange reserves.
It's real strain.
Definitely strain. Rising bankruptcies, difficulties with international banking transactions. Now, the sources note the economy hasn't totally collapsed, but this disruption is happening while simultaneously Russia is rapidly expanding its war economy. And that expansion seems to be crowding out other sectors and coming at the expense of, ordinary people's spending power.
A clear picture of economic pressure, even if it's not a total knockout blow. Now, there's a finding in Source 3 about human rights that really jumped out at me as, well, counterintuitive.
Ah, yes. This raises a really important and frankly quite unsettling point. You might naturally assume that if you weaken a government economically with sanctions, maybe you also reduce its ability to repress its own people.
Right, that seems logical. Less money, less capacity for repression.
That's the traditional logic. But Source 3 presents strong evidence suggesting the opposite can happen, that sanctions can actually correlate with increased levels of political repression by the targeted governments.
Increased repression. Wait, really? How does that work? Why would making a government poorer make it more repressive?
It seems to come down to political incentives and regime survival. The sources argue that leaders in these targeted countries often find ways to shield themselves and their core supporters, the ruling coalition, from the worst direct economic pain. They might use remaining resources strategically, lean on third parties, even turn to smuggling. The source mentions Yugoslavia in the 90s as an example to keep their power base intact. Meanwhile, the general population bears the brunt. Crucially, most targeted regimes still retain enough capacity to carry out repression.
Okay, so they can still do it, but why increase it?
Well, the leaders often see sanctions as an existential threat, a direct challenge to their power. So resisting the demands becomes paramount to avoid looking weak, both to their own people and internationally. The argument is they then have a strong incentive to crack down harder on rights and freedoms. It's a way to signal defiance, consolidate control, and quash any potential unrest that might bubble up because of the economic hardship caused by the sanctions.
So repression becomes a tool to manage the internal pressure cooker.
Exactly. And they can even use the sanctions themselves as a kind of excuse. They might justify restrictions by saying they're needed for national unity against foreign aggression. The sources mention Cuba and Iran doing this, claiming it's about sovereignty. There's another mechanism suggested too. Sanctions can sometimes weaken the state's ability to oversee its own agents. Budget cuts might hit things like police oversight bodies. Less oversight could mean more abuses like torture or excessive force by security agents who aren't being properly monitored.
That's sobering.
It is. And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the sources suggest that while sanctions are often sold as this nonviolent policy tool, their actual track record, specifically on human rights conditions within the targeted country, might actually be quite negative, potentially doing more harm than good in that particular dimension.
That is a really powerful and deeply challenging finding from the material. Given these kinds of impacts, it probably shouldn't be a surprise that targeted countries try hard to get around sanctions. The sources talk quite a bit about evasion.
Oh, definitely. Targeted economies learn to adapt, they build resilience, and they use all sorts of methods to evade the restrictions. The sources mention things like Russia developing a shadow fleet of oil tankers to keep exporting crude outside the normal, insured, trackable maritime system, and using backdoor trade routes or indirect exports via third countries.
Right, like that specific example given about Kazakhstan.
Exactly. The sources pointed to this big jump in Kazakhstan's electronics exports to Russia. It looked like a clear case of trade deflection goods that couldn't be sent directly were being routed through Kazakhstan instead.
So how do the sanctioning countries try to fight back against this?
Well, it becomes this constant, cat and mouse game. They try to tighten the measures. They add specific items to high priority lists, like certain electronic components that could be used in weapons systems. And increasingly, they're putting pressure on companies to do more due diligence to basically guarantee that their restricted goods aren't ending up in Russia indirectly through these third countries.
It sounds almost impossible to completely seal off every avenue.
It's incredibly difficult, yes.
Another major point discussed, especially with Russia, is the sheer complexity around what actually happens to all those frozen assets.
Yes, this is hugely complex, legally and politically. The sources break it down between assets belonging to individuals and companies and the assets of the Russian state itself, like the central bank reserves. For individuals and firms, we're talking billions frozen in places like the UK and the EU. The material gives some rough numbers of sanctioned individuals and entities as of early 2025.
And what happens to that money? Can they get it back?
Well, that's the thing. The sources note there isn't really a clear path or incentive structure for them to get those assets unfrozen right now, unless they mount a successful legal challenge against the sanctions themselves, which apparently has mostly failed so far. They mentioned UK Supreme Court cases. Even the offer related to the Abramovich-Chelsea sale, where the money was potentially going to be used more broadly, was rejected for that kind of general use. The current setup doesn't really offer these individuals a way to, say, change their behavior and get their assets back. They're essentially stuck.
Okay, that's individuals. What about the big one? The Russian state assets, the central bank money held abroad.
Now that's described as a real legal minefield. Because these are mostly unilateral sanctions, not UN mandated, the legal basis is complicated. Russia could, in theory, challenge these actions under long-standing principles of international law, things like non-intervention in other states' affairs, sovereign equality, state immunity, which usually protects central bank assets very strongly, maybe even trade rules.
So Russia could argue these seizures are illegal under international law.
They could certainly try. Now, the sanctioned countries would argue back. They'd say these are justified countermeasures taken because Russia itself acted unlawfully, the invasion of Ukraine being the prime example. But the sources point out this argument is quite controversial, especially when it comes to central bank assets. Messing with the principle of sovereign immunity for central banks could potentially undermine global confidence in the system.
How so?
Well, if countries start thinking their central bank reserves held abroad aren't safe from seizure, it could erode trust in Western financial institutions and potentially harm the leadership role of, say, the US dollar or the euro. It might push countries to look for alternatives.
So just grabbing the assets is legally risky and could have unintended consequences down the line.
Exactly. Which is why, the sources explain, there's been a move towards a kind of compromise solution, particularly in the EU. They detail this 2024 agreement to use the revenues or profits generated by the frozen Russian central bank assets, most of which, around $210 billion, are held in Belgium.
Using the profits, not the assets themselves. How does that work?
The idea is to take the interest and other income earned by those frozen assets and channel it via something like a Ukraine loan cooperation mechanism to help Ukraine pay back loans it's receiving from the EU and G7 countries, like that big $50 billion support package that's been discussed. So the narrative is that Russia indirectly ends up paying for Ukraine's defense efforts using the income from its own frozen money.
That's quite an intricate workaround.
It is. And what's really fascinating here, as the sources highlight, is this ongoing international debate and the sheer novelty of the legal and financial mechanisms being cooked up in real time to deal with these huge frozen state assets. It really shows how dynamic and contested this whole area is.
It absolutely underlines that these aren't just simple static decisions. They involve evolving